Adair Institute for inviting me to present my thoughts on George Orwell to you. I particularly want to thank Debbie Schneider for all of her efforts in bringing me here, and obviously to Dale for creating this wonderful, wonderful institute, and also for all the hospitality she has shown me in just the last 3 hours. Truly amazing. One personal confession, I am deathly afraid of flying. I've probably flown 3 times in the 21st century, but the invitation to come here was so attractive to me that I got on the plane despite all those fears. So it's really a tribute to all that you guys have built here. I really appreciate being here. Now, my broad topic for today is to discuss the relevance of George Orwell in the era of Donald Trump. Now, Orwell's books have always remained in print, but the public's interest in Orwell undoubtedly dipped after the end of the Cold War. But since 2016, sales of Orwell's 1984 have soared, both in the United States and abroad. Believe it or not, 1984 has even been a big seller in Vladimir Putin's Russia, and even topped the bestseller list in Russia after his invasion of Ukraine in 2022. 1984 also still has the power to frighten autocrats, as seen by the banning of the book in Belarus just 3 years ago. Now, my talk today will start with an overview of Orwell's general political ideology and historical significance. Then I will talk about a surprisingly bipartisan embrace of Orwell in 1984 in the Trump era. And after that, I will offer some thoughts on the dilemmas facing the Democratic Party in the era of Trump, and what Orwell might say about how the party could change course in order to more successfully compete in the future. Finally, in the spirit of Orwell, I hope to provoke an advanced conversation and debate, and I welcome the conversations to come the most. Okay. Orwell, can everyone hear me? Orwell is undoubtedly the most influential political writer of the 20th century. No question mark needed. The body of work he left behind is even more impressive when we consider his entire career was contained within just 2 decades. Orwell died at the very young age of 46, just a few months after the publication of 1984, his most famous and celebrated book. In fact, last week marked the 75th anniversary of his death from tuberculosis. Now, part of the darkness of 1984 surely comes from the fact that Orwell was in great pain and, in fact, dying while writing the book. But he conceptualized the book when he was quite healthy, and the book really represents bringing together many of the themes that were in the book. I was talking someone before about Keep the Aspidistra Flying. The ending of 1984 is almost incredibly, I don't want to say stolen since it was his own work, but he took it from that earlier book. It's the same basic literary technique. Well, we could talk about those sorts of things. By the way, just for a quick, I'm a political science professor, so I do not approach Orwell generally from a literature perspective, but Orwell is obviously important in both ways. Orwell would be studied today at colleges and universities even if he never wrote 1984. 1984 is indeed the most important political work of literature in the 20th century, but if it isn't, that honor would almost certainly go to Animal Farm, which Orwell published at the end of the Second World War. For many Orwell aficionados, and I just ran into one a few minutes ago, his personal account of the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia, is often thought to be his greatest work of all. I'm actually going to argue later on in this talk that Orwell's 1937 book, The Road to Wigan Pier, should be read by all of those thinking about the future of the Democratic Party. Finally, when he was not writing books, Orwell wrote countless essays, many of which have been highly influential and are still read today. So let me provide a brief overview of Orwell's own politics, which are often misunderstood. Orwell's early political writings were mostly harsh and insightful criticisms of both capitalism and imperialism. Orwell spent 5 years in the Indian Imperial Police Service in Burma. He then went on to spend 2 years taking the lowest of jobs and traveling with hobos and tramps throughout England. Orwell was always a man of the left, and someone who was and described himself as a democratic socialist until the day he died. Now, both parts of that formulation are critical to understanding Orwell, both the democracy and the socialism. The reason is, in the 1930s and 1940s, there were many people on the left who were apologists for Joseph Stalin and the awful political situation in the Soviet Union. Orwell experienced this. By the way, Orwell never visited the Soviet Union, but Orwell experienced the willingness of communists to lie and make things up firsthand while he was fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Both he and his fellow militia members, who were largely Trotskyists and anarchists, were denounced as fascist agents by communists in Spain and elsewhere in Europe. That experience, which he documented in Homage to Catalonia, was undoubtedly the fundamental political experience of his life and led directly to many of the themes found in both Animal Farm and later in 1984. Now, combating the influence of Stalinism on the political left was crucially important to Orwell. Like Trotsky, Orwell saw the Soviet Union as a revolution betrayed rather than a revolution fulfilled. When intellectuals blindly supported the Soviet Union, Orwell thought they set back the cause of socialism. Now, despite his hatred of Stalinism, Orwell was never a simple right-wing anti-communist. In his dying weeks and months, he fought back against those who tried to portray 1984 as a critique of socialism, and particularly the British Labour Party, and of the entire political left. It's actually sad. It's how Orwell actually spent the last few weeks of his life, fighting this kind of movement that he had become an anti-communist, and that was it. For Orwell, decent political movements were always about equality, liberty, and democracy. Socialism was about very simple things. While Orwell was born into what he called the lower upper middle class, his sympathies were always with the working class and opponents of capitalism. Now, it's worth noting that Orwell did not see himself primarily as a novelist or as a journalist, but as a political writer, motivated to expose something he thought was a lie or to help end some political injustice that angered him. He saw his job as a writer to push the world in a better direction, but at the same time, he also took the craft of writing very seriously. Orwell is not just someone who has some political views and just crafts books that are of little value. He's got both ends of the spectrum covered. Orwell's main concern was always with the role of intellectuals in politics. Orwell thought that intellectuals were generally a not great group of people. He thought that intellectuals everywhere too often put themselves at the service of state power or corporate power and used obscure or pretentious language to conceal the truth, advance lies, and to justify actions that were plainly unjustifiable. You can see those concerns throughout 1984. For Orwell, the real danger to society lay in the acceptance of a totalitarian outlook by intellectuals of all colors. And it was imperative for everyone to fight those trends and tendencies wherever they appeared, whether on the right or on the left. Okay, we now turn to a discussion of 1984 in the Trump era. Now, obviously, 1984 was not an obscure book before the rise of Donald Trump, having already sold over 30 million copies since it was released in 1949. But Orwell's election in 2016 clearly sparked a wave of renewed interest around the world, actually returning it to the #1 position on Amazon's bestseller list in 2017. Now, sales of 1984 particularly shot up after Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway went on Meet the Press and defended, Orwell would not like me for doing this, a very dubious claim that the attendance at President Trump's inaugural was the largest ever in history. I don't know whether you guys ever remember this controversy, but these are pictures of, this is Obama's inaugural, this was Trump's inaugural, and this dominated everything. The main beneficiary of this was George Orwell's estate, because once she did this and claimed that the Trump administration had its own alternative facts on the crowd size, many observers saw it as reminiscent of Orwell and doublethink and other inversions of logic and reality, led to great increase in sales for 1984. Now, President Trump's election, or re-election, however people want to look at it, in 2024 also led to a great jump in sales for 2024. It hasn't gotten back to the #1 list, but it is, I checked it last night, it's at 25 on the Amazon bestseller list, But Animal Farm is at the 30th on the bestseller list, so Orwell has 2 books in the top 30. Not bad for an author who has been dead for over 75 years. Why are large numbers of people in America and around the world turning to Orwell over the last decade? It can't be reduced to one single cause. Now, if you read liberal publications like The Atlantic or The New Yorker, or get your news coverage primarily from The New York Times, Orwell is almost always invoked as a political visionary whose work serves as a clear alarm bell against political leaders like President Trump. Whether it's President Trump's penchant for misleading or outlandish claims, or his often tough rhetoric or imagery, liberals tend to see Trump as a 21st century version of Orwell's Big Brother. For much of the modern American left, Orwell is a voice from the past who would surely be part of the current resistance to the president. Now, in the highly politicized era and highly polarized era in which we live, one might think that if liberals on the left embrace Orwell, then conservatives and those on the right would be considerably less enthusiastic about embracing Orwell. Now, although that would be a reasonable inference, there's no doubt that Orwell is also experiencing a renaissance on the American right. For example, in response to his father's banishment from Facebook and Twitter in 2021, Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, quote, "We are living Orwell's 1984. Free speech no longer exists in America. It died with big tech, and what's left is only there for a chosen few." After his book contract was canceled by Simon & Schuster in the aftermath of the events of January 6th, a book with the title The Tyranny of Big Tech, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri complained that the move, quote, "could not be more Orwellian." Now, that reference to big tech is kind of ironic at the moment because 2 of the great symbols of big tech have also been improvingly invoking Orwell in recent years. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world and the owner of X, is a huge Orwell fan and often uses Orwell to attack liberals and his critics. He has popularized on X hats that proclaim, "Make Orwell fiction again," and t-shirts that ask, "What would Orwell think?" It's kind of sobering to think that the richest man in the world proclaims his dedication to Orwell, a socialist, while also being a close advisor to a president who many view as the kind of leader Orwell sought to warn about. I think Orwell would be confused, to say the least. Now, more recently, as some of you may have heard, Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Meta, announced that Facebook and Instagram would no longer employ third-party fact-checkers to verify information posted on these platforms. Meta's lavish support for fact-checking arose after the 2016 election, and it was a response to liberal complaints about how disinformation allegedly helped elect Trump. But in the aftermath of Trump's recent election, Zuckerberg has argued that this fact-checking process served to restrict free speech, and that it was too reminiscent of Orwell's 1984 because the fact-checking was one-sided. Now, needless to say, critics of Zuckerberg's actions have also invoked Orwell and criticized Meta's move as a capitulation to Trump that will enable the government to manipulate things to their advantage. Now, more generally, for many modern American conservatives, Orwell is seen as someone who would be on their side in the current battles against political correctness or wokeness, and an opponent of the ongoing domination of liberalism in the traditional media or the legacy media and on college campuses. Needless to say, Orwell's fans on the right see Trump's recent victory as very much a win against what they see as a collective liberal version of Big Brother. In short, Orwell is one of the only writers that I can think of today who's invoked favorably across the political spectrum as a fellow traveler on both sides. Actually, I can't think of anyone else who actually does command support on both sides of the political spectrum. So, what would Orwell think about the relevance and message of 1984 in the Trump era? That is a complicated question with a complicated answer. First, we should always remember that Orwell did not consider 1984 to be a work of prophecy. Is that my phone? Or? Nope, it's okay. It's okay.
That's George Orwell.
Calling for the past. So first, we should always remember that Orwell did not consider 1984 to be a work of prophecy. He intended it to be a warning about a possible future, but not an inevitable one. Now, this idea that the world of today somehow was predicted by Orwell a long time ago is just not very accurate. And I think it's often made by people who have forgotten the novel world of 1984. Remember, for Orwell in 1949, from that perspective, the last 75 years have arguably turned out far better than Orwell would have envisioned or feared. After all, the Soviet Union and totalitarian communism eventually did collapse, and without a Third World War. The states of Eastern Europe today are now generally thriving democracies, something that Orwell did not think was going to happen. Orwell greatly feared a nuclear war that never occurred, as well as a kind of alliance among the superpowers of the world that also never happened. The Orwell of the late 1940s was not at all optimistic about the prospects of totalitarian communist regimes being overthrown, but he was very worried about whether democracy and freedom would survive in the West, which they have. On balance, I think Orwell would look at the world of 2025 and say that he could and did imagine far worse outcomes and situations than our current one. I don't think Orwell's, if he were with us today, would say, yeah, I called it and I told you so. I don't think that would be his attitude towards the world today. Now, he wouldn't say, wow, I had it totally wrong and there's nothing to worry about, but I don't think this kind of common view of Orwell's relevance today is an accurate one. Second, I think Orwell would be the first to acknowledge that he did not provide any answers in 1984 about how to stop the emergence of totalitarianism. I think that's the premise of a lot of people who say, hey, you should read 1984. You'll know how to see things coming. Now, the totalitarian superstate of Oceania is already well entrenched at the start of 1984, and Orwell does not ever suggest that the people could have done anything to prevent it. The protagonist of 1984, Winston Smith, wants to join a resistance he is not even sure exists, but he gets nowhere and gives up fairly quickly. In fact, 1984 is an exciting and suspenseful read, but it's also a depressing one. Orwell offers no solutions or hope for the current or future people of Oceania, and eventually the book ends with Winston Smith saying the words of surrender he vowed never to say. Now, I'm not going to say them here because I don't want to ruin the book for anyone who might be inspired by this to go out and read 1984, but many of you already know what those last 4 words are. Third, there is no doubt at all that Orwell would be very worried today about the implications of big tech. Orwell at heart was a traditionalist and deeply worried about how technology and modernization, particularly when married to politics, were destroying older ways of life. Orwell would have much rather have lived in the England before the First World War than the England that emerged after the First World War. Now, the association of technology with surveillance and oppression is a critical aspect of 1984. Now, ironically, Apple used Orwell in 1984 to make exactly the opposite argument about technology in perhaps the most revolutionary television ad of all time. I don't know whether people are familiar with the Apple ad of 1984. If we went back to December 1983, Apple was not a leading computer company. That company was IBM. And Apple was going to hopefully revolutionize that world by introducing the Apple Macintosh computer, which they thought would then bring the computer into everyone's home. And the way in which they wanted to sell the computer was to say, you know what? This computer will help us fight oppression, will liberate people. And that's why the ad ended with, on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The whole premise of the ad, which only ran once, was this woman athlete throwing that sledgehammer at a telescreen of Big Brother, and the whole world opens up again. Now, Orwell would have hated this idea of technology and computers as kind of liberating forces. That's not the world he saw. But there is something to that argument. You can hear stories from activists around the world how technology has helped them organize resistance to oppression. The only point I want to make here is this battle between whether technology will be a force of oppression and domination or liberation is an argument that's going to go on throughout the 21st century, and there is going to be no permanent winner or loser. It's going to be a constant struggle. This is what we will be fighting about in the future. By the way, when you watch the Super Bowl 2 weeks from now, You owe that all to George Orwell too, because Apple ran this ad during the Super Bowl, and that's where the whole tradition of people paying millions of dollars for 30 seconds and making Hollywood productions out of ads, it all comes from Apple's decision invoking Orwell in 1984. I could go on about that, but that's an interesting side note. Okay, what I'd like to turn to now, and no one should worry, this is not going to be well, maybe it will be a contentious conversation. What I want to do is bring Orwell into an ongoing national conversation, and one that's only going to increase in intensity moving forward. And that conversation is about how and why the Democratic Party lost 2 out of 3 elections to Donald Trump between 2016 and 2024, and what needs to do to win in the future. In my discussion of 1984, I emphasized that Orwell was always an equal opportunity skeptic of all political parties and leaders, but it should never be forgotten that Orwell's fundamental political allegiance was always to the left and the working class. To many on the left, Orwell was a real pain in the neck. And the reason for that is he always thought that it was easy for people to criticize people on their own side, people on the other side of the political barricades, but very hard to criticize their own side. Orwell is the opposite. Orwell spent almost all of his time critiquing people who were supposed to be fellow political allies. Now, Orwell's big political question was always, why are working class people not supporting the political parties and movements that claim to represent them? Now, that basic question is and will be at the heart of current debates within the Democratic Party as well. Now, Orwell's own guiding principle is that conservative movements win because parties on the left do a very bad job of selling their cause to working class people. Okay, at the risk of oversimplifying current debates, I would argue there are 2 basic camps in the Democratic Party of today. The first camp, which comprises much of the current leadership, generally believes that there is no reason to fundamentally reevaluate what the party stands for and how it has conducted itself in the Trump era. Yes, obviously this camp regrets that Trump not only managed to win all 7 swing states, but also managed to become the first Republican to win the popular vote since George Bush in 2004. But from this status quo perspective, the seeds of the defeat were firmly planted with President Biden's decision to run for a second term, followed by his disastrous debate performance in late June. Internal party polls at the time suggested that Biden was behind before the debate and that things only got worse after the debate. To be sure, party leaders did not think a Harris defeat was inevitable. She raised record amounts of money, unified the party, and took the lead in many polls, beat President Trump in their September debate, and seemingly kept the race close all the way to the end. In the end, there was no landslide. Trump's margin of victory was only 1.5 percentage points, which is much smaller than the margin of Biden's victory in 2020. Now, although Harris lost all 7 swing states, the margin of defeat was less than 2% in 5 of them. In short, if you accept this interpretation, there's no need for a major autopsy or a major party shakeup. Sometimes you lose elections, and this one they were dealt a particularly bad hand by the former president. Now, the second camp within the Democratic Party takes away much more fundamental lessons from this defeat. Now, this camp also does not personally fault Harris, but they do think that the party does have some fundamental problems that go well beyond Biden's decision to run for a second term. I think the 2 best representatives of this position are Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Much to the chagrin of party leadership, Sanders put out a statement the day after the election calling the outcome disastrous and declaring that, quote, "It should come as no surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them." Chris Murphy, who attended Williams College, where I teach, has been making similar and more expansive arguments about how the party has also failed to deal with the anxieties of working class Americans. Murphy argues that the party needs to adopt a more economically nationalist perspective that can compete with Trump's obvious appeal to workers. In addition, Murphy has argued that the party needs to have a much bigger tent on welcoming working-class voters who might not accept the party's perspective on the entire range of social and cultural issues. Now, for anyone over the age of 50, where I fall, this party debate might seem kind of Orwellian. Of course the Democratic Party is the party of the working class, and the Republicans are the party of the rich and the well-off. But this historic identification of the Democratic Party and the working class no longer comes close to reflecting reality. White working class voters have been moving away from the party for several decades, and that movement has picked up even greater steam in the Trump era. Without throwing out too many numbers and statistics, more Republicans today consider themselves working class or lower class than do Democrats, 46% to 35%. 62% of Democrats identify themselves as upper middle or middle class, while only 53% of Republicans identify themselves in that way. In the most recent election, Americans without a college degree preferred Trump over Harris by 56% to 43%. Trump also won a majority of voters earning between $30,000 and $50,000 a year, while Harris won a majority of voters earning between $100,000 and $199,000. Harris's margin with voters earning under $30,000 a year was actually quite modest, only 50 to 46%. Now, given these numbers, it should not come as a shock that Harris and associated political action committees raised and spent $2.7 billion in this election, while Trump and associated political action committees raised and spent only $2 billion. It is true that 52 billionaires threw their support to Trump, but Harris actually had the support of 83 billionaires. Now, in short, based on just economic data, it would be hard to conclude that the Democrats are the party of the people and the Republicans are the party of the wealthy. Now, the loss of support for Democrats from working class voters has not escaped the notice of the party, but its importance has been minimized. The Democratic Party's strategy in the Trump era was best expressed by Senator Chuck Schumer in 2016. Responding to the concerns that Hillary Clinton was not performing well with working class whites because of issues like immigration, Schumer argued that it didn't matter because, quote, for every blue-collar Democrat we lose in western Pennsylvania, we'll pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs in Philadelphia. And you can repeat that, Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin. Now, despite the fact that this strategy did not work out very well for Clinton in 2016, it is essentially the same strategy Harris pursued in 2024. Harris ran a very moderate, non-populist campaign aimed at winning over more upscale suburban voters who might even identify as independents or Republicans. Trump ran as a populist, Harris did not. Now, this orientation towards a suburban, college-educated, Republican moderate voters, rather than workers without a college degree, obviously it lives on. It explains why Harris spent so much time with Republican Liz Cheney this electoral season trying to go after suburban wealthier voters rather than using that valuable time to go after traditional Democratic constituencies. Needless to say, none of these appearances with Cheney helped Harris very much in the counties and states where they campaigned together. Now, despite the lack of Democratic success in designing winning presidential campaigns, many analysts continue to suggest that it is the right strategy for the party, and they should continue to orient themselves this way moving forward. Just last week, writing in the Washington Post, Fareed Zakaria argued, quote, Democrats have many electoral advantages. They have a solid base of college-educated professionals, women, and minorities. Many of the swing voters who have helped them win the popular vote in 7 of the past 9 presidential elections are registered independents and suburbanites. Quote, for emphasis, perhaps they should lean into their new base and shape a policy agenda around them rather than pining for the working class whites whom they lost decades ago. What Zakaria is essentially doing is saying, look, the Democratic Party no longer needs to identify itself as the party of FDR and the New Deal. They need to come up with something new to reflect the reality of who their actual party members are and who their voters are. All right, now some of you might be saying, wait a minute, we got lost. We started off with Orwell, now we're talking about Democratic Party politics. I want to bring Orwell back into the equation. Now, The America of 2025 is not the same as the England of the 1930s that Orwell lived in, but the question they are grappling with is exactly the same. Why are left parties that claim to represent the working class losing those voters to parties on the right? In Road to Whig and Peer, Orwell put forward a largely sociological answer to that question. Noting his own middle-class origins and prejudices, which he fought against almost his whole life, Orwell argued that the socialist movement was overwhelmingly led by people with exactly his background, and that wasn't a good thing. Orwell thought this was a problem because Orwell thought that middle-class advocates of socialism tended to alienate actual workers with their more refined habits and incomprehensible language. He also thought that socialism tended to attract and support people that he called, quote, cranks, whose behavior alienated working class people. It's a little outdated, but Orwell had in mind things like vegetarianism, sandal wearing, sex maniacs, pacifists, and fruit juice drinkers. For Orwell, all of these things alienated actual workers. And also, rather than focusing exclusively on the issues of greatest concern to workers, wages, working conditions, British socialists tend to get hung up on issues of arcane theory and other issues of remote concern to workers. Orwell would not have been someone who offered his pronouns at the start of the meeting and things like that. Finally, Orwell thought that British socialists spent way too much of their time and energy preaching to the converted, talking to people who were already socialists rather than trying to win over people who are on the other side of the barricades. Okay? This is, I think, a good indication sometimes of one of the real problems that Democrats face today. Not surprisingly, Orwell would side with those in the Democratic Party who want to focus on winning back the working class. Orwell would not have belonged to a political party that was primarily aimed at appealing to higher income professionals rather than lower income workers. It's not an accident that Winston Smith, the hero of 1984, is convinced that the only hope for a revolution in Oceania depended on the efforts of the uneducated masses rather than with the more educated party members like himself. That element of 1984 can be traced back to Orwell's direct experiences with workers in the 1930s. Now, there's of course a very practical reason for the Democratic Party to focus its future efforts more on winning over the working class, lower income, and less educated American voters. Those groups taken together represent a clear majority of the electorate. 57% of American voters have never attended college or obtained a bachelor's degree. 60% of American voters have a total family income between $30,000 and $99,000, and Trump won a majority of those voters, as well as greatly closed the gap with voters earning less than $30,000. Trump won 46% of voters earning under $30,000, while Mitt Romney only won 35% of those voters in 2012. You don't need a college degree to conclude that you would rather have advantages with larger rather than smaller demographic groups. And that is really the short story of the 2024 election. Harris did well with well-educated, higher-income white voters, and much worse than Biden with voters outside of those categories. Now, some of you might be thinking that refocusing Democratic energies on winning back the working class and lower-educated voters sounds really good in theory, but then it's unclear how that can be done in practice. Again, if I had the definitive answer to that problem, I would be spending much more of my time in Florida, enjoying life. You guys have it really good down here, and I'm going to carry these memories for the next few months of winter. The problem is even harder for Democrats to solve when you consider that Joe Biden was arguably the most pro-worker, pro-union American president since FDR. Biden devoted far more resources to plans and programs designed to benefit the working class and lower income Americans than Trump proposed to do, but none of this helped Harris at all in the last elections. If you can't win back the working class with policies that deliver tangible economic rewards, then you can see the logic behind the Chuck Schumer strategy and the Fareed Zakaria proposal. Essentially give up on trying to win back the working class and focus efforts on college-educated professionals, women, and minorities. Now, What would Orwell recommend to Democrats who want to win back the working class and win presidential elections again? First, I think Orwell would recommend a party focus on issues of class rather than identity politics. By the way, Orwell spent his whole life in a world that didn't know identity politics, DEI. His focus always would turn to class, but I think it also can be a winning strategy too. The problem with the Democratic Party is that Harris did very well with college-educated voters and women, but the strategy of relying on minority voters took a big hit. Trump won 42% of the Latino vote and 47% of the Latino male vote. In his first presidential run, Trump won only 28% of the Latino vote. That was a remarkable rise in less than a decade. So how do we explain why Latinos turned towards Trump despite his focus on issues like immigration, which many liberal Democrats see as racism, plain and simple? That's too big a question for me to answer, but a story in the New York Times published in November about South Texas provides a great deal for Democrats to think about. South Texas is a generally low-income, overwhelmingly Hispanic region of the country. It has traditionally gone Democratic by large majorities. Trump won only 5 South Texas counties in 2016, but in 2024 he won 12, and the region had 8 of the 10 counties in the entire country that switched the most in the direction of Republicans from 2020. In Starr County, Texas, Trump lost to Hillary Clinton by 60 percentage points in 2016, but in 2024, he beat Harris by 16 points. That is a truly stunning turnaround. Now, obviously, Trump did not win over the Hispanics of South Texas because they thought he was a racist. Based on the interviews conducted by the Times, poor South Texan Hispanics emphasized how they were able to buy far more groceries during the Trump years than the Biden years, and that was basically determinative for them. They were also concerned about losing their jobs because of what they saw as the Biden administration's hostility to the oil and gas industry. They were also influenced by Republican ads over Democratic support for transgender surgeries, which they felt went against their social values. Last, but certainly not least, they were very concerned about the chaos and illegal border crossings, which affected them directly and led to some of them losing their construction jobs because employers preferred to hire newer, undocumented arrivals for less money. My point of citing all of this is, this story would not be shocking to Orwell, who would always expect that working class people, regardless of their ethnicity, are going to respond to their economic situation above all else, and they are likely to be far more socially conservative than those who attend elite universities. That was true in the England of the 1930s, and it's true in the America of 2025. Second, and finally, I think Orwell would urge the party to do less preaching to the already converted and engage in more dialogue with those who might be outside party orthodoxy on some issues. The best way to illustrate this point is through Democratic encounters with perhaps the most popular podcaster in the world, Joe Rogan. Rogan is particularly popular with young men, a demographic that is also very weakly represented now in the Democratic Party. But in 2020, Bernie Sanders went on the show and received Rogan's enthusiastic endorsement. Almost immediately, Sanders received serious criticism from many liberal organizations for accepting and promoting an endorsement from someone they claimed, with fairly scant evidence, was both transphobic and homophobic. Now, fast forward to the 2024 election. President Trump went on Rogan's podcast and talked for 3 straight hours, despite the fact that Rogan had once called him, quote, an existential threat to democracy. Now, Kamala Harris was offered the same opportunity by Rogan, but she turned it down because of worries that her staff and progressive organizations would revolt against her if she went on the show of someone who they thought was obviously reactionary. Now, over 30 million people watched or listened to the Rogan-Trump podcast, and a man that was willing to endorse Bernie Sanders in 2020 went on to endorse Trump in 2024. Now, the fact that Harris was willing to throw away this influential platform is troubling. and one that Harris would suggest should be avoided by the party moving forward. If Orwell had some advice that could be put on a bumper sticker, I think he would say the party needs to move economically left, but move away from cultural or social leftism. Obviously, there's much more to talk about, and I hope we can do that. But now, perhaps it's a good time to open it up for questions. Thank you for being audience. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It's
Thank
very
you.
informative. I disagree entirely with what you said.
That's okay. All of it?
Most of it, yes.
Okay.
Because I wouldn't put...
I always teach my students to give the positive first, and then...
Well, I said I enjoyed your talk. I wouldn't have put Trump up there. I would have put Biden up there. Because Biden, with his progressive theme, trying to be the next FDR, okay, drove away his constituencies. And he drove away his constituencies by throwing money at them. Trillions and trillions of dollars that led to this inflation.
Well, that's correct.
Which caused these people to not be able to put food on the table.
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that argument, by the way.
And so, to suggest that Trump fed into something which is unusual is ridiculous. He was a populist person.
Yep.
That rode in garbage trucks, worked in McDonald's, okay, and had Hillary and Harris was nowhere to be seen. Plus, she couldn't put two sentences together, okay, that anybody could understand.
That's not true.
Well, okay, maybe not. She put three sentences together. So, but I ask you, look at Britain today. Look at England today. What would he say today? They elected a Labour government as substantial majority.
Right.
Back in the spring. Okay, their readings now have gone down through the roof, through the floor. Okay, if they had elections today, they would be thrown out. Okay, so what would Orwell think about this desire for this progressivism, which really puts people obviously behind the eight ball?
So fair enough. By the way, I just want to say, I'm not sure exactly what I said that we're disagreeing with here, but let me focus this on you brought up the example of McDonald's. This is actually a good contrast to make my point. Now, everybody remembers Donald Trump going to the McDonald's in October, serving people and everything else. Kamala Harris, by the way, whether we know or not, actually worked at McDonald's as a college student. But here's my point. Wait. Here's my point. I want to make this, which is, I think when people think about Trump and his whole persona, his love of McDonald's is well known. He served it at state dinners. My point here is, Trump has won the allegiance of working class America. People think that he is much more like him than Kamala Harris is. And that's kind of amazing in many ways. And that's what I'm trying to argue.
Why is that so amazing?
Why would they think that?
So
Why
Trump,
would they think that? I think you're wrong to think that.
Yeah, totally wrong.
I mean, he was a very populist fellow who was able to get down to their level, even though he's worth a lot of money, okay, and appreciate their real problems. Whereas Harris
all true.
was up here somewhere. We're not sure where she was. But she never got down and talked to basic people about their basic problems.
Look,
can I just follow up on that point?
Sure. I'm sorry.
It's rather ironic that right now the tables are turned and Trump is really, screwing the working class in every way possible that you can think of in his policies. And can you please, talk about that?
It's been 10 days. I don't want to get into a discussion of the last 10 days. Look, I just want my argument to the gentleman in the back is, I'm trying to argue, I think, that Trump has done a very good job of successfully appealing to working class Americans, and that's to his credit. My other argument was I think Democrats have done a really bad job of doing all of these things, and that's why they're losing elections. So I'm not sure where our argument is here.
I think the Democrats are pursuing what they've always pursued, this progressive argument. It's not working.
But my point is, Democrats used to win, and now they're losing. That's
Because you can only fool people so long,
okay. Fair enough.
and eventually reality sets in.
Fair enough.
I think I'm next, Professor McAllister. An excellent presentation, very, very enjoyable. But I wanted to challenge one of your assumptions, which is
Sure.
if George Orwell was here today, he'd be a Democrat. I think he'd be a Republican. And I mentioned RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, but more
Sure.
specifically, I mentioned Trump's commitment to, say, lifting income taxes on tips for waiters, support for tariffs in order to strengthen American industries, his commitment to the auto workers, and his rejection of subsidies for electric vehicles. That is to say, it seems to me there really is a strong argument to be made that Trump is the Democrat of the FDR ilk.
I wouldn't necessarily dispute that argument. I think Orwell would have lots of problems with the Democratic Party today. I think it would be the sort of historical identification with the working class. Look, I think Orwell was someone who would find it very hard to wrap his head around the fact that he was supporting a party, again, led by a billionaire, the richest man in the world. I think Orwell would have had a very tough time coming to terms with it. But this argument, Orwell would also say, wait a minute, how can I be a part of the Democratic Party that's basically aiming itself at college-educated professionals, people making more than $100,000, while the so-called party of the rich actually is where the working class is. Orwell would say, hey, Democrats, why is it that that has happened? And he'd say, it's because you abandoned the working class a long time ago. Also, and this is the other point, I think Orwell would say, look, you guys have also alienated the American people, or the American working class, with lots of PC and wokeness stuff that I totally oppose. And he'd say, hey, I went through that in the 1930s. I used to watch socialists trying to win over the working class, and they do a whole bunch of crazy things. That's why I called them cranks, and said they were horrible to the cause. So, Fred, and by the way, it's an honor to me. I used to read your columns in the Post a long time ago. I'm glad we're having this argument. I don't disagree with you at all. I think Orwell would be, again, deeply uncomfortable with both parties at this point. But by the way, that's saying a lot for a person who considered himself a democratic socialist, that would even be a choice today.
Thank you for your.
Interest to me as a footnote. Wouldn't you say when he was in Spain with the POUM, with the
Yes.
bomb, that he was more or less an anarcho-syndicalist communist, not really a democratic socialist at that point?
There he was much more. You were right. That he was much more of a kind of revolutionary socialist at that time. Never fully never a communist though. Good. Yes, more revolutionary. Also, in the context of a civil war, democracy's not really on the table. Although, by the way, Orwell went to Spain to basically defend what was the Democratic Republic of Spain.
Thank you for your great historical investigation.
Sorry.
Thank you for your investigation into historical and contemporary analogies. That was terrific, Orwell. So there are many reasons, of course. Everyone could, go into the minutiae of all the reasons why the Democrats lost. I mean, starting with Hulk Hogan ripping his clothes off. I mean, I had to look away. I couldn't believe anybody would even consider that as a political reason to vote for someone. However, I thought it was very offensive to be chosen as a Republican convention. But I just think the basic reason why the Democrats lost is because throughout history, every time there's a great change, there's always 180-degree shift in the opposite direction. And this woke stuff, made everyone go nuts. They couldn't take it anymore. So that's why they all voted Republican.
Look, I think a lot of the seeds of the Democratic defeat were sown in the summer of 2020, where basically American society fell apart in lots of ways, and I think the backlash to that. And by the way, the point that was made before about how Biden's kind of massive infrastructure plans fueled inflation, that ultimately did him in. You're right. People don't care about projects that are being made when they can't afford groceries. So, yes, I agree with you.
I think it's simpler. The Democrats did a variety of things that they thought would enhance the well-being of the lower end of the economic spectrum. They didn't. You had inflation. Everything they did that they thought was helping the working class was hurting the working class. And the results were people were a lot worse off after 4 years of Biden than they would have been. Similarly, in terms of the social aspects that you referred to, the woke extremism pissed off the working class. They didn't like that. So you had, it was pretty simple. What they did didn't work. It hurt the working class, and the working class rebelled, both from anti-social measures and bad results from their economic measures.
Yeah, we're spending a lot of time on this. I just want to make one basic point. Orwell would not be a fan of wokeness or political correctness. That's the point I've been trying to drive home. Orwell, if he could talk to Democratic Party leaders, would say, look, what works on a college campus does not work in the national political arena, and we need to move away from that as quickly as possible, because it is hurting us with exactly the constituencies we need to win over. Yes, couldn't agree with you more.
I don't think people voted for a party this time around. I thought they voted for the individual. Harris came from the party that brought all those people in across the border, and the border was a big concern. And Trump, said he's going to shut it down, and he also talked in sort of a low-class way that I think attracted the middle and the lower class, the working class. He talked to them, while I don't think that Harris did. Thank you.
Yeah, by the way, again, I think to develop on some of these themes, Orwell wrote a series of essays during the Second World War called My Country Left or Right. Orwell was at heart a kind of English nationalist to a certain extent. Yeah, he believed in all workers are good people. Look, I think the lesson of the Trump era is, and someone might argue with me about this, but is Trump president of the United States twice without the issue of immigration and democratic failures over immigration? I don't think so. Immigration has been the issue that has fueled Trump. And I think Orwell would say, look, there are reasons for that. Immigration has been, the basic democratic position on immigration has been, it's not really a big problem to us and we're not really going to do anything about it. That was a horrible, catastrophic mistake from a party perspective, and I think they paid for it in losing 2 elections. I'm not sure that's controversial, but...
I just wonder, in late September, before the election, Trump was asked what he was going to do about all the people that were dying of the disease because they weren't being treated, and he said, I'll get to that eventually.
What disease?
Well, the virus that had been killing everyone over that...
Oh, 2020, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so why doesn't anyone pay attention to the fact that a couple 100,000 Americans died because Trump didn't pay attention to the virus?
God, I don't really want to get into too many arguments about the virus, and I don't want to get into arguments about the actual outcome of the 2020 election. I think there's no doubt that Trump did lose in 2020 because of COVID. COVID was the issue that undid him. So I'm not sure that it's fair to say people didn't care about it. Now you're saying whether they didn't remember about that? Well, look, this is something Democrats do all the time, which is, wait a minute, what about this issue and that issue and these convictions and everything else? None of it kind of adds up, I think, for some of the recent things I talked about today. Because Trump has managed to... Sorry.
A point you made I thought was important, is that Orwell deserved a lot of his criticism. He was a man of the left for
Yes.
people on the left.
Absolutely.
It seems to me this country would be well served if more people looked at their own political party and in criticism at the authoritarian tendencies within that party.
Look, I think that is absolutely correct. I think that is a wonderful, wonderful principle for everyone to adopt as their own. If this is my team, I'm going to criticize what my team is doing wrong rather than spending all of my time saying what I think the other team is doing wrong. That's easy. The other conversation is hard. I think that is what Democrats need to do. At the moment, Republicans have just won an election, so they're going to be less likely to engage in that process. But that may change over time, too.
What do you think Orwell would have said about birthright?
Birthright citizenship. That is a great question. Look, I think Orwell was very conflicted about this issue. Remember, Orwell was born, fun fact, Orwell was born in India. He wasn't born in England. His family's business tradition was sort of serving in the British colonial bureaucracy. Orwell, by the way, went to Eton, the great British boarding school, but didn't go on to college or university, and Orwell went into that. And basically, after 4 or 5 years, he's like, I don't really want to be in the business of supervising others. I think Orwell would have said, look, we owe something to the people we've colonized. I think he'd also say, bringing people together is a very complex and difficult project. I think he would probably have wanted to see if you could have more things, but I think birthright citizenship, it's more American. It's hard for me to figure out how Orwell would have navigated all of that in the 1930s, but it's a fabulous question. One of the problems of doing this talk is a lot of these issues, like immigration, were not issues that would have remotely crossed Orwell's mind at the time. I'm sorry. I'll go here and Debbie, I'll let you decide who's next.
Just getting, and I know we've only been in this administration for 10 days, but just getting back to sort of Orwell and things that we saw in 1984. How do you think Orwell would respond today to things like, I want people within their jobs to report on other people doing X, such as I want people to report on DEI activities now that I've said DEI activity. I mean,
that would not have been something Orwell would have supported. He would have said, hey, workers, are supposed to stand together. You should not have one worker informing on another worker. There are, of course, those moments in 1984 where parents are turned in by their children and other things like that. No, Orwell would have found that chilling in 1984, reminiscent.
Thank you. You're an educator. And could you briefly comment on your opinion about education at the moment, or anything that you'd like to say about what you're observing on campus and as relates to this subject?
Yeah.
Or any subject.
So look, I think for most people who don't spend all of their lives around people between the ages of 18, 21 and see the stories in the national press, I think the general image is that college campuses are totally crazy these days with lots of crazy DEI bureaucracies that are forcing people what to think and what classes are taught and everything else. Anti-Semitism issues, horrible and everything else. And look, there's some truth to all of that. At the end of the day, no one at Williams College has ever told me what I have to teach. No one's ever made a comment on any remark I've made in a classroom. I've never had students, report me because I said something that they didn't think was correct or went against their judgments. Obviously there are lots of things that you have to navigate, but a lot of that stuff you get around. Look, colleges should be diverse in lots of ways, not just who's there, but what ideas are represented. Colleges fall, especially liberal arts colleges like the one I teach at, we are certainly not, all voices are equally represented. That's not even remotely the case. But there are room for lots of voices, and I think, this could be arguable, I think we've reached peak kind of wokeness, peak cancel culture, and I think that stuff is going to slowly go down. And I think that would have happened regardless of who won this last election, by the way. And now the whole question is whether maybe it gets revived or the curve of its decline goes even greater with Trump. Look, I think people are moving on from kind of peak wokeness, peak cancel culture. And those events, you know, it might be hard to know. They've become fewer and fewer over the last couple of years. I think the curve is certainly going down. It's not like it was in 2018, 2019, where it seemed like every week something was happening. I spent a lot of time studying Woodrow Wilson, and people forget, you know, Woodrow Wilson has been totally removed from Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson's responsible for the modern day greatness of Princeton, and the college university has basically expunged it. I don't think today that would happen to the same extent. That's a particular fever moment.
I think that's the end. That's the last question.
Fabulous. I appreciate it so much. You guys are very tough. I love the questioning and I love the challenges. Thank you.